Good evening, everyone. I trust that you are well. We are going to start in a minute or two. Just need to get a bit more organized. Just trying to line things up. You'll excuse me just whilst I do this. 1 second. Yeah, so that needs to go there. Bear with me 1 second. I'm almost there. Okay. Right. So where do we start? So probably the best place to start tonight would be from the beginning. Okay, so this week's Parsha, I hope that you can see and hear me. This week's Parsha discusses about the greatest moment in Jewish history. I'm referring no less to the moment of Kabbalah Torah, the giving of the Torah, divine revelation, when we stood at the foot of Mount Sinai and God spoke to the Jewish people. Now that is certainly the focal point of this week's Parsha, but there is something, friends, that came before it and seems rather innocuous, insignificant, and it is the preface to the giving of the Torah that we want to focus our attention on today and to ask just a very blatant, obvious question. And on doing so, in the short amount of time that we allow ourselves, I always stress, it's called a burst of inspiration, not a marathon of inspiration, and therefore we will try and keep it around 15-20 minutes. But I'd like to share with you two approaches to answering the following question. And the question is as follows. We know that the beginning of the Parsha embarks by introducing us to Moshe's father-in-law, Jethro. Yitro comes. We know that he was the priest of Midian, the high priest of Midian, and he comes along, and like all good father-in-laws, he starts to meddle in his son-in-law's business. You don't know the way you're running things. You don't know what you're doing. Let me give you some advice, says Yitro. And their obvious question is, what is it doing here? There is much discussion about whether it actually chronologically took place before the giving of the Torah or not. But be that as it may, the question is, everything is positioned not just because of chronology, but because there is significance to juxtaposing things. So what is the essence, the significance of having this as a preface to the giving of the Torah? Again, Yisro comes along, he sees Moshe is judging the people, all the court cases, adjudicating every court case that the Jewish people had. Moshe knew the law, no one else did at that time, and Moshe, therefore, from morning to night, is judging. There's a long line of people, and Moshe is, of course, got the weight of the entire nation on his shoulders. And Yisro comes along and it says, Naval Tibol, Moshe, what are you doing? You can't carry on this way. You're going to surely fall. You're going to burn out, right? The first accusation or question of burnout, this week's Parsha. And the question seems that that what Yisro is saying is blatant. It's obvious. Moshe sees long lines of people standing, waiting there from morning to night. Yisro comes along and suggests, I've got this amazing idea, this great innovation. No one would have thought of it. What is it? You're going to have establish a judicial system, courts, a hierarchical structure, so that each lower court can deal with the simple cases, and only the most difficult cases will go to the higher courts, and ultimately the most difficult and important matters will still come to you. What a great insight. What an astounding thought. Who would ever have come up with it? I mean, did not Moshe realize that he couldn't carry on this way? For sure he did. According to the Abarbanel, in fact, he says that Moshe had planned to set up courts. The giving of the Torah is about to arrive, and with the giving of the Torah, of course, the new judicial system will be introduced. In fact, we find something astounding. Moshe takes on board exactly what Yisro says, as a good son-in-law does, and he introduces this court system. But I want to share with you 2 approaches, okay, if we have time. If you're good, we'll do 2. Okay, I'm going to try and cut through it very quickly because I'm conscious that we try to keep it short. So allow me to try to rattle through at least 1 approach. Maybe we'll get to 2. So what is this teaching us? So there is a verse from Mishle, which says as follows: that the lates, the person that's a bit of a I don't know, a fool, an idiot, right? So you give him a smack. So the lates, the joker, you give a smack, and the fool will learn from the smack of the joker, and the wise person, you just give a rebuke. It's a bit of a conundrum, isn't it? So a riddle for you. Mishle says as follows: the fool, the comedian, the joker, such a person, when they're doing something wrong, give them a smack. The fool will learn from the smack of the joker, and the wise person, you just have to rebuke. Just by speaking to them, they get it. Okay? So you have 3 people: the joker that doesn't get it, the fool that learns from the joker, and the wise person that is able to be communicated, he can understand, he can process, and he can take it on board, internalize the rebuke. Okay? What exactly has this got to do with us? So there's an astounding, baffling medrash which says like this: Yitro is a symbol for one of these 3. And that is that Yitro is seen as the fool. Okay? Amalek was seen as the lates. Now, Amalek, we know, are the arch enemy of the Jewish people. They attacked us from the rear. They attacked us first. And they were known to not believe, to be the first agnostics, atheists, didn't believe in God, ridiculed everything and everything that was serious in this world. So Yitro, listen to this, stay with the thought. Yitro is symbolized as a fool. Moshe is symbolized by the wise person. Stay with it. I said we're going to go very deep, but we will come out hopefully the other end. Don't lose my train of thought. So Rav Tzadok, the great mystic who we always like to quote in explaining mystical ideas, Kabbalistic ideas, he says, why is it that Amalek, the archenemy of the Jewish people, are referred to as this this joker, whereas Jethro, who was the father-in-law of Moses, is referred to as the fool? And he says that the basic element for a person, and this is an incredible insight and profound idea, something which is a real landmark for us to learn. He says the basic element to become a tzaddik, a righteous person, the building blocks, the foundations, is what? Emunah, faith. And on the basis of having faith, everything else, all the other lofty concepts, principles that we have in Judaism can be built. But first and foremost, you need to have faith. And therefore, he goes on to say that the faith that we have, where does faith come from? So faith, the basis of faith is being willing to listen. If you're not willing to listen, if you think you know everything, then you're not going to get anywhere. But if a person says, I don't know everything, I want to hear, I want to listen, I want to learn, because I recognize, I know that I don't know, that is the starting point when one has faith to becoming a God-fearing and righteous person. So let's go back and try and answer our conundrum as to this absolutely baffling medrash, and we'll use the ideas, the deep mystical ideas of Rav Tzadok to hopefully explain it. So therefore, this medrash is saying you should hit the scoffer. Who was that? Everyone remember? That was Amalek. Why? Because Amalek, we said, had an inability or unwillingness to receive. They didn't want to know. They didn't want to recognize God in the world, despite them experiencing and witnessing the same as Yisro, the same as the rest of the world. They wanted to deny God, deny any responsibility that should be on their shoulders, deny the fact that we're meant to live an uplifting moral life. There are responsibilities. I'm meant to shoulder the mantle of leadership. That is Amalek. The other end of the spectrum is we have who? Is we have a Yitro. Okay. Now Yitro had the quality that he recognized he's symbolized, the caricature is the fool. The fool is somebody who simply says, I don't know anything. Whatever you say, I'm going to believe. You know why? Because I don't know. So that was Yitro. And he had this great quality. Remember, he came, he wasn't Jewish, he converted. And therefore, when he came to the Jewish people, he believed everything that he heard. It was for that very reason, in fact, that Yitro initially went round the world and tried every single faith, every single pagan practice. He said, I don't know yet. I don't know. I'm not in a position of knowledge, of knowing, of authority. I have to open my eyes and see what's there, and then I'll find the right way, but I don't know. I think many Israelis have taken up the Yisro path, trying every single pagan practice as they used to before the COVID, be known to go to the Far East and to try all the various different paganisms in order to try to find meaning, and eventually they find it in God. In fact, there's an incredible story about one of the masters in the Far East that he found himself with an Israeli, a backpacker, and he said to him, why are you coming to discover our wisdom when you as a Jew have your own wisdom? Fascinating. But Yisro nonetheless had this incredible simplicity in not recognizing that he was starting from a place of not knowing. So if we go on, okay, Yisro, right, therefore was willing to accept and take on board his faith. He believed everything. And that quality of being willing to accept, acknowledge that you don't know, enabled him to have total faith. And his simple faith brought him to starting a relationship with God and becoming a member of the Jewish people. If we go on from here, he said the idea is, if we carry on to the Rav Tzadok, and we're cutting to the chase, there's much more to say. Moshe, why did he resist? Why is it he didn't? That's the question. Why didn't Moses want to introduce and establish a court system? Why is it he didn't think of it by himself? Moses was the greatest Jew that ever lived. He couldn't think by himself that it would be a good idea with thousands of people waiting for their court case to be adjudicated. Why didn't he suggest, you know what? I think it would be a good idea. It had to be that he waited for Yisro. So the simple plain meaning, the way people explain it, right, if you open most of the books, would be that Jethro came along, he saw there was a long line. Moshe knew that the Torah was going to be given in a few days, and therefore he was willing to wait so that it would be in line with the giving of the Torah. Yeah, that's the way they explain it. Once Jethro comes along, he suggests it in order not to upset his father-in-law. He says, you know what, even though we were going to do it, we'll do it now. See their barber now. But says Rav Tzadok HaKohen, he says as follows, it's fascinating. He says, Moshe and Yisro represent diametrically opposite perspectives in service of God. Their starting points are completely different at this stage. Let's think about Moshe. Moshe had the closest relationship with God. He was coming from a place of knowledge, of wisdom, of expertise. And he wanted to keep adjudicating the cases of the Jewish people. Why? Because Moshe thought that if he was able to keep judging these cases, to keep teaching the people, his influence would rub off on the people, and eventually, instead of making them reliant like a crutch on teachers, on rebbes, on rabbis, he wanted to make the Jewish people at that moment in time self-sufficient, so that they would be able to have clarity of vision and answer their own questions. The Jewish people would know instinctively what is right and what is wrong. Now, that would be the eventual state, that will be the eventual state when we come to the Messiah. But Yitro recognized that there was a stage that needed to come before that. And that stage that was needed to come, said Yitro, is you can't build for the Jewish people these lofty stages of wisdom, put it on their shoulders until they first have this elementary basic faith, a position of not knowing, because there is a quality in not knowing. It is the portal and the gateway for us to be able to enter into a position of growth and a position of striving for truth throughout our lives. Yisro, coming from his humble beginnings, having searched around the world for meaning, and eventually having a fresh appreciation of what it means to find truth. This is something, this characteristic he wanted to imbue into the Jewish people, and he felt that this was the foundations on which everything else would stand. For that reason, Yisro said, this must come first. Moshe had the best of intentions, and he wanted the Jewish people to already skip to the time of the Messiah, and that they should have this self-sufficiency. But Yisro recognized, and Moshe eventually came round to his way of understanding and thinking, that you know what? I need the Jewish people will gain more through having this not knowing position, asking questions of others. It'll build and foster a relationship with other people, with other Jews, and it will also give them a thirst and a search to grow, because they will have this characteristic of not knowing. They'll be willing to listen. And therefore, that, according to Rav Tzadok, is the divergence in the opinion as to why Yisro thought that they should establish the courts of law, and Moshe thought the opposite. I think that this has broad applications, and in 1 minute, I just want to share with you my thoughts. You know, they say that B'mokom shabale tshuva oimdim, in the place where a penitent, it's a Baal Teshuva, a repentant person stands, a complete tzaddik, a completely righteous person cannot stand. That seems preposterous, does it not? A person who's righteous all of their life, a person who has led a wayward life, and now he's coming back. And then because he's coming back and he was way off, he was Las Vegas, spieling and having a great time. He comes back and he says, oh my gosh, I've woken up. I want to come back to my roots. Him, we're saying, is in a greater position when he comes back than a righteous person. How can that be? The whole of his life, the righteous person's been doing the right thing. And the answer is because if we look on the cosmic camera and we look precisely at that moment in time, we freeze time, you'll see that the person that has the greatest ability to receive, to absorb, is the person who's coming from a position of not knowing. A person who went astray and comes back, or a person who's a convert, they simply don't know. It's all new to them. They absorb like a little toddler, like a newborn child, very quickly, because you're starting with a blank slate, where there's an appreciation for everything that they are able to glean. And that is the attitude we have. So often we stifle our own personal journeys and odysseys of growth simply because we turn around to ourselves and we say, I know it. We don't listen to what other people are saying. We're not willing to have constructive criticism because we've got ourselves in a habit of thinking that we are in a position of knowing. But the truth is, real growth comes from recognizing and having the courage to go back to the Yisro model and saying to ourselves, I don't know. I'm just beginning. And that is what it's all about. And that's why we call a great sage, we call them a Talmid Chacham. They're a student of wisdom. Even if they're 95, even if they're the greatest sage in the world, they are still considered only students of wisdom, because it's that mindset, that vision. If we have that Jethro mindset, that Yisro mindset, then we can still accomplish and grow. That's idea number one. Okay, so I've spoken for 20 minutes. I'm going to share with you very briefly, if I can, one further idea, okay, which is actually in the insight which I will be delivering to your email probably tomorrow morning. Let me share with you one more idea. So we've asked the same question. We're gonna answer in a slightly different way. The question again: why is it that we needed this parsha? Why do we need to learn and hear about Jethro? Why is it that Moshe takes on board Yisro's suggestion when in reality Yisro himself, Yisro introduces the idea of a court of a judicial system, an adjudication with a hierarchical structure, delegation of responsibilities. Moshe takes it on board, but why didn't Moshe think of this? Why is it only when Yisro suggests it does Moshe take it on board? So I want to share with you a Gemara. There's a couple that I could suggest. I'm going to share with you the easiest one because we're short of time. And that is as follows. A famous Gemara, famous section of the Talmud you've probably all heard of, but let's just go over it. There was a dispute about a certain matter. It was about the impurity of an oven that was cut into parts. It doesn't matter. And the Talmud tells us as follows. There was this dispute. How were they going to solve this dispute? So Rebbe Eliezer brought all types of proofs that why he was right. Remember, eventually we have to reach consensus in Jewish law. So Rebbe Eliezer brought all types of proofs as to try to persuade and compel his adversaries, quote unquote, so that they should agree with his view and it should be incorporated into law. And he says Rebbe Eliezer was a great man. He performed these great insights and wonders. And he says, if the law is as I say, then let a carob tree prove it. The carob tree all of a sudden was uprooted from its place, a distance of 100 cubits. Some say it was 400 cubits. And what do the other rabbis say to him? That's not impressive. You can't prove anything from a carob tree. Rebbe Eliezer says, fine. If the law is as I said, let an aqueduct prove it. So the water in the aqueduct began to flow backwards instead of downwards. It started to fly upwards. They said to him, you can't prove anything from an aqueduct. Then he says, if the law, Rebbe Eliezer says, is like me, then the walls of the base of Medrash, the walls of the study house should prove it. All of a sudden, the walls of the study house began to cave in. So the walls didn't fall in deference to Rabbi Yeshua, but the point is the walls stayed as the way they were. And again, the sages say that if the law is as I say, may it prove it from heaven. So Rebbe Eliezer, this is his final move. This is the big one. What does he say? If the law is as I say it is, let's prove it from heaven. And then a heavenly voice came out and says, the law is like Rebbe Eliezer. Again, Rebbe Eliezer has performed miracles, wonders, all of them seeming to indicate that God is showing the rabbis that he is correct. It's vindicating the position of Rebbe Eliezer. A heavenly voice proclaims, Rebbe Eliezer is correct. Doesn't get better than that, huh? Imagine in an argument with your spouse and the heavenly voice says you're right. Anyways, Rebbe Yeshua stood on his feet and said to Rebbe Eliezer, Lo bashamayim hi, the Torah is not in heaven. We don't need to take any notice of the heavenly voice. What's going on? I would have thought the greatest proof is that when God Almighty says from heavens that the halacha, the Jewish law, follows a certain opinion. Why is it they didn't listen? And they said after that, because it was written by God at the time of the giving of the Torah. It's written in the Torah that we follow the majority in Jewish law. We are the majority. God gave us the Torah, and it is incumbent upon us to follow the principles of the Torah. An astounding section of the Talmud. What is important and relevant for us about this particular point? It is as follows. That God gave us, at the time of the giving of the Torah, he gave and entrusted us with the ability and the responsibility to continue, based on the principles of the Torah, to develop and expound and apply halacha, Jewish law. It's now the Torah is in our hands, not in God's hands. And therefore we are meant, as it were, to be the custodians and to apply it in the various circumstances that we face in any given time. Applying it to this particular case, Yitro now came along and he introduced a new concept, right, that was not there yet. Moshe knew it was coming along, but this was where an individual saw something that was in line with the Torah thinking, and he was innovating, he was adding on to it in a halachically permissible way. And Moses says this is what the whole giving of the Torah is about. It's not about just an inanimate object, a scroll, but we are getting an oral tradition as well as a written tradition. The written Torah does not change. Every letter stays the same from time immemorial, from the giving of the Torah. But the oral Torah is an organism that is a living, breathing organism that's constantly evolving and growing and developing. And this section, this idea that Yitro is suggesting of adding something which in any case we were going to do, but it's being introduced by human beings, reflects the greatness of the oral tradition. And therefore it is a fitting preface because it really shapes the contours of where we stand in terms of the Masorah, the tradition and the transmission of Jewish law. We have a written Torah which is unchanging, but the oral tradition, the oral Torah, which stands alongside, shoulder to shoulder with the written Torah, and is really the soul of the written Torah. That is something that is for us to nurture and to develop in each generation. And Yisro adding on this section to the Torah is a celebration of the oral Torah and the ability for us to have input into the Torah and into its development. So therefore, there are two lessons for us to learn, and they are in a sense opposite. The first approach we took this evening was to show a position of not knowing. That was the position that Yitro said was incumbent upon us, basic faith. So when we hear something, and it may be a view that we may not have heard before, or we don't agree, we have to say to ourselves, do we have the courage to listen to a different perspective, even though we may not be willing to take it on board yet, or to internalize it as a part of our lives? Let's be more willing to listen, even if we don't feel we're ready to take it on. Lesson number one. Lesson number two to the same question was the idea that we have a share in the Torah. It's our Torah. It's no longer God's Torah. He gave it to us, and the oral tradition, the transmission goes from rabbi, from teacher to student, from student to their student, and so on. Please God, we should all be able to play our role in the development of the oral Torah, of the beauty of our Masorah, our tradition, that we should be able to be passed with an unbroken chain from generation to generation until the times of Moshiach Tzidkeinu b'mheira b'yameinu. Amen. Wishing you all a Shabbat Shalom